Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. Today it is the 2nd of October, and in today's upload we're looking at Russian advances along the border between Zaporizhzhia and Dnipro. Then we'll zoom in on the battles for Myrnohrad, especially along the eastern flank where the Russians have entered into a new mine ventilation shaft. Then we'll look at what's going on in the Kucheriv Yar Pocket, because there's a lot of ambiguity regarding whether there's a Ukrainian counterattack or the Russians are gaining back the initiative. And to finish off, we'll look at the Kleban-Byk reservoir and the pocket to its south, because now the Russians have taken over the village of Kleban-Byk itself, which served as the eastern access point to the pockets. And so that's a really important update that we'll get into and we'll talk about its implications. But to zoom in over here, you can see that these yellow polygons indicate advances over the past 48 hours. I'm going to turn on the fortification map for the purposes of this sector, because you could see over here that the Russians are bypassing a lot of those fortifications, but also taking some of them over. But let's zoom in over here on the advances east of the Dnipro River, because the Russians are getting very close to actually reaching the river physically. So to the west of Olhivska, they've captured 2 square kilometers worth of territory, and this accounted for a westwards advance of about 2 kilometers, meaning that they are very close to reaching the hamlet of Okhotnichny. And let's actually measure the distance that the Russians have to continue pushing towards, and it's only about 2.5 kilometers. And at certain points, especially in relation to Poltavka, they are very close to reaching the river. For instance, we talked about this in the previous video, they've already entered into the southeastern parts of Poltavka, meaning they are only about 500 meters away from reaching the river. From this protruding point, the Russians are only 1.4 kilometers away from reaching the body of water, meaning that a sort of salient is beginning to form in this outstretched portion of territory controlled by the Ukrainians in the open fields north of the Dnipro River. So that's an area that the Russians are looking to squeeze the Ukrainians out of. And this is a common theme that we've seen develop in recent days. The fact that the Russian forces are initially developing really deep penetrations, not across a narrow part of the front line, but across several layers of tree lines. And so we see this over here, to the largest degree with Olhivska. After the capture of Olhivska, the Russians from the 394th Regiment continued expanding westwards along these specific tree lines. And then from there, they also accompanied that with a push along the northern flank of the salient that was formed. So the Russians are trying to isolate Ukrainian squads that continue resisting on the eastern bank of the river by just bypassing them and creating very narrow and very deep fire bags. So the Ukrainians are preemptively forced to withdraw, lest they get cut off either physically or the supply routes. Any sort of movement in and out of the pocket becomes impossible. And so we're seeing that over here play out in real time with a salient that has a corridor width of about 2.3 kilometers, currently in the process of being squeezed out of existence. That includes the push from the south that we see over here along this particular low-lying floodplain, but also to the north, the capture of another 2 square kilometers through open fields south of these trenches over here. These trenches are actually serving the Russians at this point. So the Ukrainians, think about it, they built these real intricate, well-defended fortifications, but couldn't man them, and they didn't plan out the layout in a way that actually allowed them to have any sort of utility along the front line when the Russians actually reach them. Now the Russians have taken them over, and they're using them as organization points for their own forward assault squads as they try to use them as a launching pad to push further westwards. And so they're actually having a boomerang effect at this point, because what's going on is that the Russians are using them for concealment. They're using them for, accumulating forces. And then from there, they get dispatched along these routes. They have pre-planned routes running along the trenches and can approach the line of contact and storm further Ukrainian-controlled trenches. And then from there, continue expanding in all directions. At this point in time, the Russians are only about 1.2 kilometers, 1.3 kilometers away from this portion of the Dnipro River that you see over here with this X. And they're also very close to taking over all the trenches that are located to its east. Now, the Ukrainians are aware of this, and that's why there's been a bit of a stabilization measure. At least 1 battalion of the 154th Brigade has been deployed to act as a stopgap, as a vanguard force in this area to hold out. And so reinforcements have been sent to some of the areas most stricken by these recent advances, and they are trying to defend in very specific corridors. But it's only a temporary fix, as the Russians have such a wide variety of vectors through which to pursue. They don't have to focus on one individually. So here we can see another one west of Novoivanivka, which is a very important organizational hub. They've been able to capture 2.7 square kilometers worth of territory. And this is a video from October 1st, backing this up. The Shadow Drone Group, it's a unit that's been rather active recently. And so they conducted FPV strikes onto Russian forces as they were pushing to the west of Novoivanivka. And in this case, they struck a tree line. So the advance amounts to about 2 kilometers westwards and is being conducted along a paved road that connects Novoivanivka to Novovasilivske. So the Russians are getting very close here to some of the open fields that are on high elevation that overlook the larger villages that run along the Yancha River, like Novomykolaievka and Novovasilivske, and also Uspanivka, of course. So those areas are now within the Russian crosshairs, and the Russians are very close. We're talking about 1 or 2 kilometers away from reaching these areas. And crossing over won't be that difficult because the river line, yes, it is on low elevation, so that in and of itself is a disadvantage. But the body of water is just very narrow and it's probably dried up in certain areas. So troops won't really have difficulty crossing over on their own. They won't really need barges. They won't need boats. They can just do it on their own. They could swim, or I don't know how deep it is. Maybe they can just walk across it in some cases, knee deep. And in any case, that's not the real issue. The real issue is the fact that there are villages over here that have to be fought over. And so there will be clashes, especially for an area like Uspanivka. But there won't be any depth. That's the worry, that once the Russians will actually get a foothold in these areas, it will be impossible to push them out. And the fate will be inevitable. And so you can also see that there are some trench networks. They're not even shown on the map over here in the trench map. But Playfair has done an amazing job marking them out in recent posts. And there are at least 37 trench networks that were built along the northern part of the Yancha River Valley. And they are small, they're independent, they're based around tree lines, which is important because that means that there is a level of concealment. So for the most part, in these areas, there are underground components or there are concealed components to the defenses. And the only parts that you can see above ground from the perspective of a drone operator would be these openings that are used to fire towards any approaching force. So that's where the small arms fire or the RPGs or ATGMs can be made useful. And that's where they have utility. But for the most part, the troops that are actually lodging over there, they are at least concealed and sometimes protected, depending on whether there was enough time to install a concrete sort of component or a wood component. But those are the sort of trenches that the Ukrainians, in theory, would have the most success with. But it doesn't really mean anything. It's actually negative if there aren't any forces there. Because if there aren't any, the Russians will use them for their own purposes, and then it actually becomes negative. To zoom in over here on Verbove, we now have a compilation video from the 37th Motor Rifle Brigade wherein they raised their flag in Verbove, so it's been fully taken over by them. You can see that that amounted to 40 hectares of territory. So they're continuing to advance along a very narrow paved road and are about to cross over the second line of defense in Dnipro/Zaporizhzhia, and from there are getting very close to Vishneve. And actually, after Vishneve, it's only about a 1 kilometer sort of advance before reaching the Yancha River line at an area that is even further, north of what's currently being engaged when you look at the Russian offensive material. So that's rather interesting, and it would put everything to the south of Vishneve and Verbove in a lot of danger, not only because it would be physically flanked from the north and the supply routes are difficult over there, but it's all just open fields. So that area will be very difficult to hold on to. Yes, there are some of those independent trenches like I talked about, but there are not sufficient forces and there aren't any strong logistics nodes nearby that can sustain any sort of long-term Ukrainian defense in these areas. So you look at how large this sort of large network of fields is, and I would say that about 63 square kilometers of territory is now potentially going to fall into Russian hands. And so that's something to keep an eye out for moving forward. Now over here in Stepove, another 4.75 square kilometers of territory captured, and northwards it's a push of about 2.2 kilometers. Stepove is a hamlet. It's currently in a gray zone, but is in the process of falling into Russian hands. Moreover, between Vorone and over here, Chernove, the Russians have captured about 6 square kilometers. So a massive Ukrainian salient that was forming in the areas to the west of Malivka that they continued to hold out in. The Ukrainians were very steadfast over here. Finally closed due to how really deep it was compared to what you would consider to be the normal line of contact. It was about 6 kilometers deep. And so the Russians pushed over here and squeezed them out of about 3 kilometers of it. But you have this remnant, a vestige of the protruding salient that remains under Ukrainian control directly south of Sosnivka. So now the Russian efforts will be focused on just completely clearing it out and fully straightening out the front line over here. Now, moving on, we can see over here in Zeleny High that it's been fully taken over by the Russian side after the bouts of back and forth at the beginning of the month. This video from October 2nd was released by the 214th Up 4 Battalion, and it shows FPV strikes onto the Russian soldiers in Zeleny High in the northern part of the village as well. So it's about 3.7 square kilometers worth of territory taken over. Looking at the advance horizontally, you could make the case that it's about 2 kilometers westwards, and then about, let's see, in the northern axis, it's about 2.5 kilometers northwards. So yeah, that advance has finally been reversed. And that was always going to be the case. But what the Ukrainians did achieve by attacking over here was delaying any sort of Russian potential for an expansion of offensive activities over here by about a month or even more. And so that was always the intention as it posited before. And now it's being reversed. But again, in the process, they're basically trading land for time. So you could see how there are a lot of other locations on the eastern bank of the river that still have to be cleared up. That would include most of Andrivka Klevtsove, and it would include a lot of open fields and forested patches south of Ivanivka. I know some Russian sources claim they've already been taken over, and they also posit the same thing about Alexandrorad, but there's no proof of it, and it's been weeks since those claims were made. So I would expect at least some evidence to back it up, but so far nothing, which is why I'm not changing the map to reflect any of that. Now, over here, we can see that there's another advance to the east of Myrnohrad. This is from October 1st. A Russian soldier was falling. They tried to climb into through a window into a building in the mine facility. So we have this something called the Kapitalna mines, and within the Kapitalna mine network, there is mine ventilation shaft number 2, and that would be this location over here. And so there's also a power station nearby, I believe, or a substation or something of the sorts. You'd have to zoom in to see. But there is this industrial facility over here, and a Russian soldier was just trying to climb into the building, but he wasn't able to, and he fell. And that was filmed by a Ukrainian drone. And that just gives us an indication that Russian forces are present over here. And yet again, another one of these landmarks that serves as a bastion of defense along the approaches to Myrnohrad is falling into Russian hands. Now, my map is very sort of favorable to the Russians over here. In a lot of areas, it's very cautious, but specifically in Myrnohrad, it is pretty favorable because I've been relying on geolocated data of Russian armored assaults, which means that it could be sort of outdated or anachronistic at this point in time, because I know that some Russian sources are claiming that the main Russian push at this point is coming directly from Lyubivka or even south of it, and from there taking over some of these mine shafts, not necessarily from Novoekonomichny and Mykolaievka, and then sort of hooking down southwards, which is what I'm implying with my map over here. So I'm going to have to do some further digging and research to get a full sort of understanding of what's going on over here and whether my depiction of the situation is actually fully accurate. But in any case, it does show yet again that the Russians are chipping away at the eastern parts of Myrnohrad and that there is this pocket forming over here. Let's see how large it is, but it's a largely open fields. You don't even see many defenses that are noticeable. I suppose they're concealed, but you don't really see any buildings or many ravines over here. It's just tree lines, and it spans about 12 square kilometers and serves as a point that bulges out from the southern outskirts of Myrnohrad. So having a straight front line over here would provide the Russians with a lot of surface area that can be used to actually begin assaulting that eastern outskirts of the town itself. But looking at the Kucheriv Yar Pocket, very interesting developments over here. I'll shut off the fortification map for this. First of all, looking at the timeline, around October 1st or September 30th, reports came out of the Russians reestablishing control over Pankivka. Now, I never marked it as under Ukrainian control or even as contested because there was never any proof of that, despite the musings of the 225th Assault Regiment. But now that same unit released videos of FPV strikes and HIMARS strikes onto Pankivka. And the geolocation does show that even the northern edge of the village is under Russian control, which confirms the depiction of the situation that we had over here for weeks. But it does also indicate that if they were correct, the 25th, that they were pushed back at some point. Furthermore, there were reports that the Russians were pushing slightly to the west of Shakhove over here and taking back some of the local marine ravines and areas south of the quarries. Now, I never had those regions marked under Ukrainian control either, so I'm not going to change the map in that region. And now, when it comes to the reports from the Ukrainian side, some mentioned that south of Zolty Kolivyaz, this forested patch over here was taken back by the Ukrainians, but that had been the case since mid-August. So it's just deep state correcting their gray zone to show that it's now fully confirmed to be within Ukrainian hands, but it's not a recent development, really. And also, in relation to Dorozhny, there was a video released on October 2nd from the Russian side, I think from Solovyev, and it shows Russian FPV strikes onto a Russian M2 Bradley after it was disabled by the mines over there. So it was conducting some sort of demining operation, and they were trying to dismount infantry in the tree lines in forested areas just to the east of Dorozhny. So it appears as if they branched out from a sort of starting point in Belitske or Chernihivka to the west and then advanced along this paved road, took this route over here, and then looped back southwards. And from there, reached the gray zone, where one of them was disabled by mines and then struck by FPVs, meaning that it was destroyed. And then supposedly the other one just withdrew. But regardless, what this indicates to us is that there is now a Ukrainian attempt at holding the line over here, meaning that there is a concern, certainly from their perspective, that the fall of Dorozhny would then lead to the fall of Nikhanorivka, which is extremely logical because when Dorozhny is under Russian control, the Ukrainian conduits into Nikhanorivka only spans about 1.5 kilometers, meaning that naturally at some point Nikhanorivka would also fall into Russian hands. And then at that point, there would be no more pressure on the logistics into the Kucheriv Yar Pocket. So that's why they conducted the counterattack over here. It's the same reason why they launched one around September 12th, a couple of weeks ago now, and that allowed them to reestablish control over much of Nikhanorivka. And this time they've not been able to penetrate that deep because the assault was stopped just to the east of Dorozhny, but it is nonetheless an advance. And so I'm marking it as such on the map. Some Russian sources also claim that they've been able to take over full control of Novoshachove, meaning that the Ukrainians would have taken over what amounts to 2 kilometers spanning worth of territory. And Novoshachove is a pretty small town running along the same particular road, but we've seen no proof backing up this claim. So for now, I'm going to mark the majority of the town is under Ukrainian control, but there likely is still a Russian gray zone or some sort of Russian footprint in the eastern part of the village, unless proven otherwise. But that would be the extent of the Ukrainian counterattack. The push back into Dorozhny and then a couple of houses being taken back in Novoshachove. That's about it. When you look at the situation as depicted by pro-Ukrainian sources, like Deep State, for instance, they've been talking about this relentlessly. They claim that there are 2 pockets, actually, or 2 pockets that have been cut off entirely. One in the eastern part of Kucheriv Yar that largely consists of open fields, but also some houses in the eastern parts of the village. Then another one that is north of Mayak. So it would be around here, I presume, in between these 2 major ravine networks that you see I'm marking over here with the red lines. So those areas are also currently considered by Deep State to be within sort of isolated pockets that's sandwiched in between the gray zone. And then from there, basically everything to the south of Mayak is under Russian control. That's what Deep State claims. But again, yes, there is fluidity. And yes, it is true that maybe my map, and yeah, this is probably the case, it's not really fair to mark everything as either being solidly red, solidly blue, or being a gray zone within the context of this battle, because on a daily basis, there are movements back and forth across the lines or across the gray zone with individual soldiers or small squads entering into these small foxholes, into these small dugouts, and then being pushed out or moving back to the rear on a daily basis. And so, yes, there is like a fog of war, and if you were to measure it out in its full entirety, then the map would look far less contiguous than you see over here in my depiction. But regardless, this is just like a general footprint or a general heat map of where each side is present. And yeah, when you see it, you understand that yes, there's no cutting off of the Russian forces in Kucheriv Yar. We've not seen any proof of that, and it's been over a month since that claim was initially made. It's been a month and a half, actually. And regardless, at this point, the troops over there would have been, long gone, long surrendered if that were actually the case. So it does remind me sort of the Vovchansk industrial zone where there were always reports of the Russians being cut off over there. And at some point, there was just like a sort of gradual renegade, and eventually they were pushed out, but they were never encircled for that long. At this point in time, the supply lines into the Kucheriv Yar pockets probably span about 2.3 kilometers and are reliant on this one specific road. Once you branch out from Novocherezk into Mayak, and then from there to Pankivka, then branch out to this road. And there was a video released from the Omega drone group, and we see them over here, of grenade drops onto Russian forces northwest of Zloty Kolodyaz. Now, I don't know if that's an old video or a mistaken geolocation, but certainly something to keep an eye out for. But I'm not going to change the map based on that, because I know that there's a lot of backlog footage that is only now being released because the video was published on Telegram on October 2nd. But a lot of these videos were recorded weeks ago or even months ago and are only now getting released. So we can't use that on its own to claim that there's been a massive change unless there's some sort of external source that's also saying it. Now, over here in Kleban-Byk, I want to end the video on this note. The village has been fully taken over by the Russians, and that accounts for 0.6 square kilometers worth of territory. Kleban-Byk was, for the past couple of days, fought over, especially the southern portion of it. As of September 30th, the southern chunk was in a gray zone, and eventually the Russians took it over in its entirety. And because of the small surface area, once the Russians were finally able to move from Katerinivka, which was also an area where the northern chunk was pretty much a gray zone and also a kill zone, you could say, for the drone crews. Once they were able to fully solidify control, it became very easy to naturally flow into Kleban-Byk because they are basically connected via road and just via proximity. And so it was stormed by the Russian side in recent days. The main units involved in the pushes over here would include the 68th Tank Regiment, but you also have the 103rd Motor Rifle Regiment, and I'll click on a couple of other ones that have been, very critical in the recent Russian advances over here. Now, what this means is that there's essentially no room of escape, no window for the Ukrainians to withdraw from along the eastern flank of the Kleban-Byk pockets, because the sort of gap between the Russian-controlled territory and the actual reservoir is only about 200 meters. So that's not going to be a feasible option unless the Ukrainian soldiers that remain committed and remain in the area south of the reservoir, unless they themselves decide to fight their way eastwards and have to push into Russian-controlled territory to do so. So I don't know if we'll actually do that, but there are two other options. One would be to withdraw along the western access points, which is also very narrow. It's on low elevation, and doing so across a floodplain out in the open could lead to heavy casualties, but there aren't many other options. So this gap would be about 1.1 kilometers in width, and you have Russian soldiers stationed in Alexander Kalinove and in Yablonivka that will be facing them. They wouldn't be overlooking them. The Russians to the south in these open fields over here would be overlooking them, though. Or they can try to use small boats and withdraw northwards along the Kleban-Byk reservoir. That's another option. But again, they would also be vulnerable to FPVs in that scenario as well. You look at the reservoir, and at its most narrow point, it's about 400 meters worth of a journey. And I suppose if you measure over here, it's about 200, 300 meters. So maybe they'll try their luck over there. But you can see there are still areas, still holdouts in this region. You have a massive brush of forests all across the southern bank of the reservoir. And here you can zoom in and see that there is the docking station, and there may be a couple of trenches that aren't even visible. There may even be a couple of dachas over here near the reservoir. And so those are the station points for the final couple dozen of Ukrainian forces that are holding out over here. So I've been asked, how many do you think are actually resisting over here? And I'd say that, probably 50, something like that. I would give or take a couple of dozen. That would be my estimates. And so they're going to have to try to withdraw. They're currently holding the width of the entire trench line that runs horizontally from Alexander Kalinova to Kleban-Byk. And doing so could be very difficult at this point in time because they're very low on numbers. And so the only reason why they've been able to hold out so long is because drone crews have turned any sort of approach towards the Ukrainians holding out over here in the pockets into a kill zone, and are just individually picking off Russian soldiers as they approach. But at this point, it reached a critical mass, and the Ukrainians are now not going to be left with any other choice but to withdraw. and we'll have to see how that plays out. So thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video, and goodbye.